All right, you should all be seeing my my Android Studio screen here. I am just going to flip to my slides because that's what you want to see first. So yeah, hello everyone. My name is Marcus Plancona. I serve the developer evangelism team at Twilio. I have been an Android developer for many years. I know you know where to find me on the internet, but I just wanted to make sure there's some information about me in here. Also, some information about Twilio. Twilio is a company I work for. If you don't know Twilio, Twilio is a communications platform that helps developers like you and I to add communications into your applications, such as like text messages, chat, video, and anything to do with communications here. So you've probably used Twilio in the past, but you don't know. If you've used something like Lyft or Uber or Airbnb, for example, it's all using Twilio on the back end. But that's enough about Twilio. I wanted to also let you know I am an Android GDE, and I am very passionate about this thing called Jetpack, which is what I'm going to be telling you about today. But I want to start like very slow here, and I want to start by telling you a story. Okay, so this is the story of the year 2017, and because we're talking about 2017, I kind of want to change these slides and say this was a long time ago, 2017, because we're talking about tech years. Okay. Back in 2017, I was writing code just like this. So I was getting my instance state just like this. And I imagined that if I could ask for some of you to like raise your hand, you would say, yeah, I still do things this way. The other thing that I was doing is I was also building camera applications back then. And again, if I could ask you to raise your hands, I'm sure you would say, yeah, I'm building camera applications, or I used to build some camera applications. And like just to kind of get started, when it comes to camera applications, for example, I think you've all seen something like this, okay? Because building a camera application is super easy right now. Well, it used to be like super easy. It's easier now, but it used to be super easy because building a camera application basically means, well, you create the camera manager, then you set up the camera ID, then you set up the camera output, then you set the transformation matrix, so texture view, and then you start a background thread, then you open a connection to the camera with a given ID, and then you set up the image buffer size for the texture view, then you start the camera module, and then you start the camera preview. That's easy, right? Does anyone else here get a mild anxiety? Yeah, I'm sure if you could raise your hand, you would. I'm sure if you could drink some conference water right now, you would. And yeah, so that's the kind of thing I used to deal with, okay? And then came Google I/O 2017. So that's talking about old markers there. Google I/O 2017, when everything changed, because back at Google I/O 2017, they announced the architecture components. So back then, architecture components was the name of it, which later just came to be part of the Jetpack family. And I remember listening to Mike Laren back then, and Mike Laren talked like specifically about Jetpack architecture components, but he used terms like scalability, and he used terms like life cycles and ORMs. And backwards compatibility, and like especially on the backwards compatibility, I remember back then being kind of like this, like, yeah, so I don't know about this. And so basically I did what most people did, which is nothing. I remained skeptical, and I was like, I am not gonna adopt this thing. So Google I/O 2018 came about. And Google I/O 2018 just absolutely changed everything for me, because at Google I/O 2018 they announced what the Jetpack components are, like what is included in Jetpack components, and it was really interesting because you had stuff like architecture components, you had behavior, you had UI and foundation, and the premise was you could standardize Android development. So if you use emojis on your application, for example, here's a way for you to do emojis. If you use fragments, there's a way for you to do it. Navigation, super interesting, because like everyone sort of like does navigation a different way. Paging and room for databases, and it's like, wow, there's like one way of doing things. And I know that if Android Jetpack is a new thing for you, and it was a new thing for me as well, you want to start slowly here. But you not only want to start slowly, but today, if you're not a Jetpack fan, I am going to turn you into a Jetpack fan. So we're going to be changing this. Let's start with the basics, because I think if you've been an Android developer for, even if you've been an Android developer for a week, you will have seen something like this, which is an application's lifecycle. So we'll look at how this is a look of how life cycles actually work in Android. Again, you have seen this before, but if you remember in my previous slide, we talked about the saved instance. So let's just go back to my previous slide where we talked about the saved instance. Let's say you have an application and your application looks like this. So you have your saved instance, but let's make it a bit more real. So instead of like saving game states, we'll make it a bit more real, and we'll turn that into a number generator application, because that's the kind of thing you want to build, right? If you want to go into the Play Store, this is where the money is. You create a number generator application, and also, notice that it generates a number between 1 and 42, which, these are all the numbers you want. Now, we have this application. We have the methods on create. And usually, if I had a regular audience, I would say, so what happens when I turn my phone? And there's always going to be someone clever in the audience who say, well, when you turn your phone, that number changes. And some people go, oh, removing cursor from the screen. Yeah, absolutely. So some people go, oh, like the number changes. And the reason the number changes is, this is expected, okay? Because every single time you change the phone, this is called a configuration change. So you get your phone, you've got your phone on your hands, you get your phone, you turn, and that's a configuration change. So every single time this will generate a new number for you that is between 1 and 42. So already the behavior here is slightly different than one would expect, because one would expect, okay, so when I turn my phone, nothing changes, I still get the same number. But no, configuration changes cause your phone to change that. And obviously, I will say here, like I'll leave a caveat here, which is I could very easily just have done some like shenanigans with my codes and says, no, I'm going to save that state. And then if you turn your phone, like the number doesn't change. But I will continue and say that what I've been using here is the saved instance state. And for the specific case of saved instance states, the amount of data should be kept small, because the system process needs to hold on to the provided data for as long as the user can ever navigate back to the activity. So let's say you had an activity and you had like a bunch of navigation in there. When the user returns, you still want to keep that same number in there. So all this is kind of like bundled inside the memory. But there is a recommendation, and this is a recommendation by Google, which says you can only store 50K of data. So you can absolutely go over 50K of data, but that's not recommended. So if you phone Google and say, hey, I'm storing 60K of data, my application's crashing, or like it's not keeping space, Google will say, well, you're on your own, I'm sorry, because our recommendation is 50K of data. Now, let's look at a different demo here, because, hey, like number generators are great. Like we all love number generators, but let's look at a real demo. And the reason I want to show you this real demo is I want to show you why this stuff is important. So I'm going to bring my cursor back to my screen, and I'm going to show some code that I've written in here. So what we have in here is we have a very, very simple application. It's got an activity, it's got a class. This is a data class with some results. And what it does is it goes into an external API, that's the Pokemon API, and it gets some Pokemon information. I've got my clients in here, and what I'm doing is like I'm actually debugging everything. Okay, so I want to make sure that I can see everything my application does. And to show you I'm not cheating, I am going to show you my phone in here, which hopefully we can get on the right light. And I am going to relaunch this application. And I wanted to see what happens when I relaunch. So basically, it just goes into the internet. It just goes into pokeapi.co and it downloads some data. Then it gets that data and it just pushes to my phone. However, what happens here is you will notice that when I turn my phone, that's a configuration change, something happens, and yeah, so it just keeps on making that same HTTP request over and over again every single time, okay? And the problem with making the HTTP requests over and over again every single time is like you are actually using real data in here. Like you are asking your whoever your customers are, whoever the people like your users are, you are actually using real data in here, and that's a problem. Now let's go back. So this is what the problem is. Now, one change that we can make into this application is we can use something called life cycles, and life cycles is a way for you to fetch some data. So I have a load Pokemon methods in here. I can fetch some data, and that data gets saved into my application's memory, but not into the on-saved instance. So I'm using a lifecycle class in here. I add a function into my application that uses live data. So whenever anything changes in my application, live data just gets an announcement here saying, hey, just to let you know, there's been a change in data. So we will pay attention specifically to the live data here and the list that comes inside our live data. Now, I obviously appreciate some people may not have used live data before, so let me just explain what live data is very quickly for you. So you have your UI in here. So this is the application example I just used, and then you have your live data object that holds the data for you. So all the data that you want to show on the screen is inside the live data object. So you can think about, like, if you wanted to make an analogy here, you can say everything that is on live data is like live data is almost like my database. Okay, so you have some data that gets stored in there. And the UI is always observing live data. So the UI is basically saying, hey, live data, if there's a change, I want to know about it and I want to get an update. So in this case, I have an API, which is the Poke API that I'm using. And whenever there's a change on the API, live data will fetch those changes. Live data gets updated, and live data will then tell my application that there's been a change. My application would then react to that change and do whatever needs to be done. So in this case, you know, some rogue Pikachu just got into the Poke API and just took over the whole thing, and everyone is a Pikachu now, regardless of like which Pokemon they are. And that's how live data works. So, but now when you look at this application here, you're probably thinking, oh, cool. Okay, so what if I wanted to be able to click on that Pikachu and see some details, for example? Like, how can I do that? So that's where navigation components come about. So navigation components are a way for you to basically do what the name says. You can do navigation using navigation components. So you can click on one of the items and you can navigate between screens. Now, the beauty of navigation is it basically handles all the data going forwards and the data coming back to you. So with navigation, you don't need to keep control of that data because the navigation components do that for you. The way navigation components, this is what a regular navigation would look like. So in a simple application, I very much like the idea of like using a standardized way. Like that's one way, and it handles navigation components handle the entire back stack for you. So when a user navigates back and forth, for example, the application just keeps track of everything. Our Pokemon application is a perfect example of something like this, because you could very easily just use the navigation components along with fragments to build something like a single activity application. So instead of having all the activities as you have in here, you could have one activity, a single activity application, and you would use just like fragments to switch things around. Now, navigation is a huge topic. Like there's a lot with navigation. And one video I would suggest watching, like if you haven't done anything to do with navigation or specifically single activity applications, there's a good talk by Ian Lake on this. So this is one I had the pleasure to see back in 2018 Android Dev Summit. It's on YouTube, and there's a link on my slides. I will be publishing those slides later as well, so you don't need to be copying these links from here. Now, navigation also has something that is, in my opinion, is the biggest selling point for me, because what you can do with navigation, and I'll just kind of give you an example here. I very often go into Stack Overflow and I look at like what are the Android developers asking the most, like what are the questions Android developers are asking the most. And I like doing this because it helps me with like creating my content. Like if I want to go and write something for our blog, for example, you know, it's cool to write about something new, but it's also cool to go and try and solve, like answer some people's questions. So I do that very often. And one that kind of like got my attention here is looking at Stack Overflow. If you look at the tab, I'm looking at the frequent tab. The question is, how do I pass data between activities in an Android application? And I went on and I clicked on this, and I noticed like it's got a lot of upvotes. It's got a lot of like answers as well. There doesn't seem to be an answer that is like the right answer. Like I don't think there was one when I looked. But the most interesting thing here is there are a lot of pages, and there are a lot of ways to actually skin a cat in here. Like you can do navigation in so many different ways, and like people do them in so many different ways. And I think this is the point of like using navigation components, okay? Because and again, this whole like scrolling was just one page. This is 3 pages of this, okay? So I can even run this thing back for you. In case you want to see that again. It's quite pretty to look at. But the point of like using navigation components is it's one way of doing things, and it's one way that your entire team will know how to do, and that's something I really enjoy, because in a lot of these cases, and I looked at a lot of these answers here. In a lot of these cases, there's no right or wrong. Like some people just implement things in a different way, but there's not really, oh yeah, this is the perfect way of doing. There's definitely the way I would have done it, but there's no right or wrong. And the way navigation, specifically passing arguments between navigation. So this is a quote by Laila Fujiwara, who works for Google, and the way Laila described navigation, safe args, like passing safe arguments in navigation, is navigation components generates classes based off your navigation graph to ensure type-safe access to arguments for destinations and actions. So this is really cool because everything that you pass between one activity to the other using navigation components, if you use safe args, you're basically saying, yeah, this is all type safe, which is great. And implementing this is very, very easy. So in this case, I have my navigation graph in here. I create an argument, which is the argument I want to pass. And I can even have a default value. So in this case, I'm passing no, and I'm saying this is an argument type string. So on the other side, if something tries and reads an int, for example, that's obviously not going to work. So it's making it type safe, which is super cool. Then on my activity, so this is the button. Like if I had an on click, so when you rebuild your project, you will now have a directions class, which you can get an instance of. And then in this case, what I'm doing is I'm updating the name of my Bulbasaur, and I can call navigate passing information. So again, just using a single activity application, I can just go and update the name of my Bulbasaur. And then obviously on the other side, I just get that. Like when my view gets created, I just get the name. Now, if you're in your receiving, so that's your receiving destination. Now, here's how that would look like. So I have Bulbasaur in here, and when I click on Bulbasaur, it turns that into cute Bulbasaur. So this is just like passing a string, okay? It's not changing anything in a database. It's not doing anything special. It's just passing on a string. Now, when we're passing a string with safe args, it's great. Like if we want to save stuff to a database, but we haven't done that yet. So what if we wanted to persist this? Like what if I wanted to really rename my Bulbasaur. So everywhere when I look on my screen, I see cute Bulbasaur, for example. Like, what could I do if I wanted to do that? So this is where Room comes in. So there's a library for that too. And the way Room works is Room is a persistence library that provides an abstraction layer for SQLite. So if you've ever done anything with SQLite, you will know what a pain it is. Like, you will know what a pain it is to actually maintain an application that uses SQLite just natively. I have used things in the past, like Realm, for example. Realm was actually pretty cool. But I do think Room is kind of, in my opinion, Room is the thing I've been using the most, because it kind of gets the best of Realm and it gets the best of like just using SQLite. And in my opinion, that's kind of like the way I always go with. Now, again, there are many ways of doing database interactions. I'm sure that if I go into Stack Overflow, there's like a few different ways of using SQLite. But the way you start using is, we already have a Pokemon data class, as I showed you in my code previously, and it looks something like this. I have my name for a Pokemon and I have a URL. What I then do is I create an entity. So I wrap this on an entity and I give it a name. So I can call my table whatever. So I'm calling my table Pokemon. So I haven't really made any changes to my data class. And I'm setting a primary key, like I'm giving it a primary key, and I'm saying my primary key, it also generates. So whenever I add a new Pokemon, it just gets a new primary key. So not doing anything special in here, but we can also rename columns in here. Like if we wanted name to be something else, or if we wanted name to be like Pokemon name, for example, we could also do that. Remember, I'm getting all this data from an API, so I obviously don't get things like an ID. But if the API had some like cryptic names, for example, I could just change that to be called something that is more useful to me. Then I create a data access object. So this is just an interface. And here is where I can go and just declare all of the things I want to do, all the actions I want to do. So I have an insert, I have an update, I have a query where I just go and select by name, for example. And the really cool thing about this, like the really cool thing about using this with Android Studio is they are all checked at compile time. And I find this really interesting. So what I mean by checked by compile time is if I have a typo on my codes, for example, I'm gonna get an error that looks like this. So cannot resolve symbol Pokemon. So it's all checked in compile time, which I find super interesting. And then if I fix that, then the error kind of disappears. So this is like what Android Studio does for you out of the box. Like you don't need to do anything as long as you're using the Room library. This is what Android Studio does out of the box. Then the next thing I need to do is I need to actually set up my database. So I need to implement my database. So I'm saying where my entities are. Obviously, I can have multiple entities. I'm giving this a version. So if I want to go and bump the version, I can just bump that number. And I set my Pokemon's database, and I say I'm using Pokemon DAO. I could have multiple DAOs as well. I could have multiple data access objects in here. And then the last thing I need to do is I just have a repository. I'm using a repository in this case, and I'm saying, here's what my database name is, Pokemon ZB. Remember we named the table in the past, now we're naming the database, and I am just initializing my Pokemon database, and I'm saying room.database builder. So just like really initializing it, and then I can start doing my queries. Yeah, okay, so and this is my database initialization, but I wanted to show you like what this looks like in code as well. So I'm gonna come out of my presentation here, and I'm gonna show you some of my code. I'm gonna switch to Room, and this is like the amount of changes I've made on this application. Okay, so obviously I've created my DAO here, my data access object. I have a method for each one of the things. So I have a method for insert, I have a method for update, I have a delete, and I have a select by name. I have a repository here. My repository is basically the thing that you've seen on the slides. I'm making sure things are async and everything, and then I have my database in here. So this is not much different from what it was. I can now go and run this application. And when it finishes compiling, hopefully I'll be able to show you a little bit of like how this is working right now. Let me try and bring this here. So I have my Bulbasaur, and what I can do is I can, from the application, I can do things like I want to make this my pet, and then the Bulbasaur becomes my pet. So now I can go back, I can go look at Ivysaur, for example. Ivysaur is obviously not my pet, but if I go back to Bulbasaur, I can see Bulbasaur is my pet. And the way I'm doing this, I'm just adding Bulbasaur into my database, and I'm saying, I'm setting a Boolean flag to say Bulbasaur is my pet. Just very simple as that. So I'm not doing anything special here, but it's kind of cool that I can get database like going on my application without actually having to write too much code. In fact, like I usually do this. Usually when I do this presentation, I actually live code this part because it's so simple. But like in the interest of time and like giving people some time for questions, I just don't wanna take up all the time. Now I'll go back into my slides here. So we looked at that demo. Now, if you wanna know more, there are gonna be a couple more things going on today. So we obviously have Camera X. Camera X is, I'll say, it's probably my favorite API in Jetpack. I had a lot of fun building things with Camera X. I wrote a blog post about it, so you can check it out on my blog. And there's also Become a Composer. So I purposely didn't mention those things in my application, even though Camera X is probably my favorite library on Jetpack. I didn't mention those things because I knew Brian and Divya were gonna talk about those two things. So Brian is talking about Become a Composer. Divya is talking about Camera X. Composer is super, super interesting. It's still a bit fiddly, as you will see today, but it's super, super interesting. And I think Brian would do a good job at explaining that. With that, like I said, I will be posting those slides later. I'll put it on whatever hashtag Greg tells me to put on Twitter. You can find me on Twitter. I'm Marcos Plancona on Twitter. All this code is also on GitHub. It's going to be on my GitHub account. And you can check a lot of my sorts of like answers to Stack Overflow questions, like unified answers, or even like a lot of the open source stuff that I write. You can find that on plancona.co.uk, which is my website. With that, I want to thank you, and I want to thank droidCon very much for having me. I have been Marcos Plancona. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Marcos, thanks so much. Fantastic presentation. Really appreciate you being here. We have Q&A. I'm going to have Uli change himself to the presenter so everyone can see the top questions that were voted on. We'll give you 10 minutes to answer them, and I'll bring everyone back in and introduce Divya after that.
Cool.
So feel free to fire away, Marcos, anytime.
Cool. All right, so I'm looking at the first question. With multi-modular architecture, where can each module, at least one activity on the rise, is on a single? I'm not sure I really understand the question here. With multi-modular architecture, where each module equals, okay, so where each module equals at least one activity on the rise, is the single activity updated? I'm not sure I understand this question. If there's anyone else who wants to help me answer the question, because I'm not sure I even understand it. I'm gonna move on to the next question and come back to this. So the next question is there any performance differences between implementing an app with multiple activities and implementing an app with one activity and multiple fragments? I haven't seen anything like this. Using multiple fragments, in my opinion, as a developer, using multiple fragments does complicate your code a little bit. but I haven't seen any kind of like performance differences. What I would say is if your application is very complex, you probably don't want to make it a single activity application and just keep on like spawning new fragments. But if you have like an application like the Pokemon application, for example, that I just showed you, that is the perfect contender for like just using multiple fragments because you don't have many of them. I'll say if you have many fragments, then you just need to be careful. That to the next question and the questions keep on like popping around, which is really exciting. In a multi-module project, what's the best design using navigation Jetpack to go from fragment in module A to fragment in module B? In a multi-module project, what's the best design using navigation Jetpack? I'm not sure I get this. I know we're talking about a multi-module, but I'm not sure I get the question. I don't think you do anything different in here. Like I work with some applications that are multi-module and I've been using fragments on those applications. So I don't think you do anything different in here other than just like injecting the fragment. I don't think there's anything different that you need to do, unless I didn't quite get the question. I have answered this one already. Now the next question I'm gonna go to, if I'm using the same fragment in different navigation graphs, I need to update. The question just disappeared. What is the best way to map Nest JSON into a room database? Okay, I'm gonna answer that because it's the one I got to read. What is the way to map? What you do is I usually just try and map the JSON into a data class. I get my data class and I map it that way. So JSON entities into you have a lot of like generators. I've used what I did last time I had to do this was I've used a generator that basically takes my JSON, turns into like a Pojo, and I just pasted that into Android Studio. Android Studio obviously just translated that. Oh, there's someone saying things for Android Studio obviously translated that to Kotlin, and then I just turned that into a data class, and that's the easiest way you can do it. Like it does, I'd say it does like 90% of the job for you. Yeah, that's how I do it. Do you think it's a best practice to use activity per feature? Oh, Jesus. I'll move to the browser, okay? Because I'm looking at the screen here, but it keeps on popping. So I'll move to the browser here. Hang on, I'm just opening it here. Is there a reason you prefer using navigation safe args instead of parcelized data class in Kotlin plus the new intent fragment.new instance? I'll say no to that. So I'm going to read the question again. Is there a reason to prefer using navigation safe args instead of parcelized data class in Kotlin plus the new intent fragment new instance pattern? I'll say no. I think that's more of a preference. If I'm using Jetpack, which is what I tend to use right now, whenever I use it, I just use safe args. I don't think there's a right or wrong in here, unless I didn't get the question right, but I don't think there's a right or wrong. Using sorts of like new intent with fragment.new instance pattern is almost like you're kind of like it's almost like you're going under the hood on the navigation safe args. So I'll say this is probably more of a preference thing than anything else.
All right, Marcus, we have time for one more question. So let's possibly two, but let's try to get two more questions in then.
Okay. Moving on to the next one, and I'm looking at my browser now because just looking at the screen here, like the questions just keep on changing. What about data binding? Is it part of Jetpack if used correctly and with any tool? Doesn't it result in untestable code? Data binding doesn't result in untestable code. No. Data binding is you can use it as part of Jetpack. Yes, I use data binding a lot. I'm not sure it results in untestable codes. I think I think most of the untestable codes I've seen is like written by developers as opposed to just using a functionality. So I would say I don't think it results in untestable codes unless you had like a different experience. Like I never really had an experience where I've used data binding, and I use data binding a lot, and I never really had an experience where like I can test all my code because of it. Cool. Yes, there's one question here that says, aren't async tasks deprecated? Yes, async task is deprecated. As I was talking about it today, like looking at my codes, I was like, yeah, I should have changed that. Yes, async tasks are deprecated. You should move away from using async tasks. There are definitely new different things that you can use. I actually wrote an entire blog post about this. So if you want to know what you can use instead, I wrote a blog post on plancona.co.uk where I talk about async tasks and their deprecation. So you are right, Mr. Anonymous. Async tasks are deprecated.
Marcos, thanks so much. Thanks also for playing question roulette with us. So we'll this is a process we're going to refine in the next, but hopefully we'll be cycling through always the top 3 voted on questions will appear on the screen. The latest question will keep appearing down below and changing. So hopefully that'll smooth out. But thanks for playing roulette with us on the questions and for the fantastic presentation.
No worries, my pleasure. Thank you everyone for having me here again. I'm happy to answer if you have a question, I'm happy to answer those on Twitter as well. So just like at me on Twitter, and I'm happy to try and answer your question too. Thank you.